The FBI has officially joined the Nolan Wells investigation, and the highly anticipated statement from his female friend has finally been revealed. These two massive developments change the entire direction of this case, directly challenging the timeline told by Nolan's friends. Today, we are going to walk through both updates carefully, separating what is officially confirmed from the noise currently circulating online. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter gave an update this week, and it read differently than anything his office had said before. He confirmed that formal witness interviews are underway and that his department has been in direct contact with outside agencies, the FBI among them. He also credited the public directly. Tips coming in this past week, he said, had genuinely moved the investigation forward, calling the response productive after his office specifically asked people to come forward. And he was plain about where things stand. This investigation is active. It's ongoing. That matters because of where this started. Ledbetter's earlier comment, "No foul play suspected," drew real criticism, in part because it wasn't accompanied by any explanation. This update doesn't repeat that language. It's more careful, more procedural. Whether that's a genuine shift in approach or a lesson learned from how the earlier wording landed, we can't know from the outside, but the language itself has clearly changed. Before this gets overstated, it's worth being precise about what's actually been confirmed. Ledbetter said his office has been in contact with the FBI. That's a real, meaningful development, but it is not the same thing as the FBI taking over this case, and it is not a formal federal investigation in its own right. No agency has announced that. What's been confirmed is contact, not a transfer of jurisdiction. It's worth understanding why a local sheriff's office would reach out to the FBI at all, even without any kind of takeover. Federal agencies bring specialized digital forensics capabilities that a small county department typically doesn't have in-house, particularly relevant here given the ongoing questions around deleted phone content. They can also assist with cross-jurisdictional coordination, which matters in a case where witnesses, family members, and now two separate autopsy teams are spread across multiple states. None of that confirms a specific federal role in this case. What it does suggest is that Jackson County's own investigation has expanded beyond what a small local office typically handles alone. And the FBI contact isn't happening in isolation. It's one of several threads moving at once. The independent autopsy commissioned by the family is being conducted separately in Washington, D.C., outside Mississippi law enforcement entirely. And Ben Crump has previously raised the question, publicly, of whether the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation should take this case over in full. Combine those three things, federal contact, an out-of-state independent autopsy, and an open question about a state-level takeover, and what you get is a case being examined from multiple directions simultaneously, not just one. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to collapse all of this into a single headline, FBI takes over. That's not what's happened. What's happened is a case that started as a single county sheriff's investigation has become logistically and forensically complicated enough that outside resources at multiple levels are now involved. That's a meaningfully different story, less dramatic in the way clickbait wants it to be, but more accurate. A CNN law enforcement analyst, a former police chief in both Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., offered useful context this week on what this stage of an investigation typically looks like. He said it's important to interview each of Nolan's friends individually, one at a time, along with anyone else who was on the beach that day, including the young woman Nolan was reportedly talking to before he was last seen. The reason for separating witnesses, rather than interviewing them together, is straightforward. It's the only way to check whether everyone's account of the same day actually holds together or starts to diverge once people aren't in the room reinforcing each other's version of events. When people are interviewed as a group or are simply aware of what others have already said, their own account can shift, consciously or not, to align with the group's story. Individual interviews remove that pressure and let investigators compare independent accounts of the same afternoon, watching for where those accounts naturally overlap and where they start to pull apart. In a case built almost entirely on competing accounts of who said what to whom, that process isn't just standard procedure. It's arguably the single most important tool investigators have right now, more so than any physical evidence, given how much of this case still hinges on memory and conversation. The analyst also made a broader point worth remembering. Nothing about the pace of this investigation, in his professional experience, is actually unusual, aside from the intense public speculation surrounding it. Gathering complete evidence and conducting proper interviews in a case like this commonly takes a week or longer. That doesn't make the wait easier for a grieving family, but it does mean the timeline itself isn't, on its own, evidence that anything has been mishandled. Now, here's the second major thread in this update, and it goes directly to the most important contradiction in the entire case. For weeks, this story has hinged on a single disputed conversation. According to Ben Crump, the young woman Nolan was speaking with on the island told him she was heading back to the boat to rejoin his friends. The friends say the opposite, that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. Two versions of the same 5 minutes, pointing in different directions. That young woman's name is Katie. Her mother, Katie McCormack, has since confirmed publicly that Katie was indeed the person with Nolan that day. I want to be precise here because it matters. Katie herself has not given a direct on-record interview to any outlet we're aware of. What we have instead is her account, relayed secondhand through her sister and her mother, both posting on Facebook. According to a post from Katie's sister, Nolan's friends were pressuring him to end his conversation with Katie so he could ride back with them. Katie had a conversation with Nolan and, based on that conversation, assumed he was getting ready to get on the boat he'd originally arrived on. Katie herself made it home safely that day on a separate boat with different people, according to the post, picked up by her sister's brother and sister-in-law. The post also states that Katie assumed the friends telling Nolan to get on the boat wouldn't have actually left without him. And it says the family has already given, in their words, all the answers they can give, both to Nolan's mother directly and to authorities. It's worth walking through the emotional logic embedded in that account, because it actually helps explain how a situation like this could unfold without anyone necessarily intending harm. If Katie genuinely believed in that moment that Nolan was heading toward the boat, she'd have no reason to think anything was wrong. She wasn't watching to confirm he actually got on. She simply assumed it, the way anyone would after a brief conversation ends and the person you were talking to turns and walks in a particular direction. That assumption, reasonable enough in the moment, is exactly the kind of small human gap that can end up mattering afterward, when everyone involved is trying to reconstruct exactly what happened based on assumptions rather than confirmed observations. Katie's mother, Katie McCormack, added her own statement separately, also on Facebook. She confirmed Katie was the young woman with Nolan that day. She said Katie has remained in contact with the Wells family since, but she was also clear about the limits of what her daughter actually knows. Katie, according to her mother, has no real insight into what happened to Nolan after the two of them parted ways. That last point matters. Katie's account, even filtered through her family, doesn't claim to know what happened to Nolan afterward. It only speaks to what she believed was happening in the moment she last saw him, that he was heading toward the boat. It's also worth noting how Katie's mother chose to frame her statement overall. She didn't use the moment to defend her daughter against any accusation, because Katie hasn't actually been accused of anything by anyone connected to this case. Instead, the statement reads more like an attempt to correct the record and provide clarity, while also protecting her daughter from further public exposure. That's a meaningfully different posture than some of the other statements we've seen connected to this case, and it's worth keeping that distinction in mind as this story continues to develop. So, does this resolve the central contradiction? Not entirely, but it does shift the weight of it. Katie is now a real, accounted-for person, not a mystery figure whose very existence was, for a while, in question. Her family, unprompted by any lawsuit or legal pressure, has come forward publicly twice to share what Katie remembers, and nothing in either statement supports the friend's version that Nolan chose entirely on his own to stay behind. At the same time, it's worth being honest about what this isn't. It isn't a sworn statement, it isn't a formal interview transcript. It's 2 Facebook posts from family members describing what a teenage girl told them about a chaotic afternoon weeks after the fact. That's meaningfully different from Katie testifying directly under oath or even giving her own on-record interview to a reporter. Until that happens, this remains an important piece of corroborating context, not a final resolution. There's also a version of this that cuts in a slightly different direction, and it's worth acknowledging honestly. Katie's account, as relayed, doesn't actually claim the friends lied outright either. It's entirely possible that Nolan genuinely intended to head back to the boat when he last spoke with Katie, and that something changed his mind or interrupted him in the short window between that conversation and whenever the friends say they last saw him. That would mean both accounts could be sincere and still not fully overlap, simply because they're describing slightly different moments, minutes apart, rather than the exact same instant. That possibility doesn't resolve the underlying mystery of what happened to Nolan, but it's a reminder that a contradiction between 2 honest accounts doesn't automatically mean one side is lying. Sometimes it just means nobody was watching closely enough, in the ordinary, unremarkable way people usually aren't, right up until the moment it turns out to matter enormously. While all of this has unfolded, the piece of evidence everyone's actually been waiting for still hasn't arrived. The independent autopsy commissioned by the family, conducted in Washington, D.C., was originally expected to be released on Friday, July 10th. Crump has said that timeline slipped because of issues transporting Nolan's body. As of the most recent reporting available, those results still haven't been made public. The state's own autopsy remains in a similar position. Officials have said toxicology testing alone can take days or weeks, since it's typically sent out to external laboratories rather than processed in-house. The same CNN analyst mentioned earlier said he's personally waited 2 to 3 weeks for toxicology results before, in cases with no particular controversy attached to them at all. In other words, the wait itself is not a red flag. It's the normal pace of forensic science, running up against a public that understandably wants answers now. I want to be direct about something here, because misinformation has become its own significant thread in this story. Multiple credible outlets, NBC among them, have published pieces specifically about how much false information and unverified speculation has filled the silence around this case, precisely because official results have taken this long to come out. Any claim you see online stating the autopsy results are already out, especially ones describing dramatic new findings, should be treated with real skepticism until it's confirmed by a credible, named source. This pattern is worth naming clearly because it isn't unique to this case. Whenever an investigation involves genuine public interest, genuine emotional stakes, and a prolonged wait for official findings, that gap tends to get filled by something, whether or not real information exists to fill it. Some of what circulates is honest speculation, clearly labeled as such. Some of it is deliberately misleading, crafted to look more authoritative than it actually is, sometimes borrowing real details from the case and mixing them with invented ones, specifically to make the fabrication harder to spot. The responsible approach, and the one we're going to keep taking here, is to wait for confirmation from sources that can actually be verified, rather than repeating claims simply because they're already circulating widely, or because they happen to align with a theory that feels satisfying. We've covered the other major threads in this case in detail before, so here's the short version for anyone catching up. Nolan's phone came back to his family with no saved Snapchat content from that entire day, checked before the 24-hour deletion window had even passed. A viral video once believed to capture Nolan demanding his phone back has since been explained differently by a close friend who says the voice on it is actually his own. A documented photo shows Nolan in blue shorts, contradicting an official report describing black ones. And more than 13 hours passed between the family's initial report and a formal Coast Guard search request. None of those threads have been resolved by this week's developments. They're still sitting there, unanswered, alongside everything new. There's also the question of Judge Ashley Cole's public statement, which described her son Warren's account of the timeline in detail, but notably left out any mention of the phone, the keys, the video, or the deleted messages. And there's the matter of the friends themselves, all of whom retained legal representation early on, and none of whom, according to Crump, have had any direct conversation with the family's legal team since. Every one of these threads represents its own open question. None of them moves closer to resolution just because two new developments, the FBI's involvement and Katie's family coming forward, have entered the picture this week. If anything, each new thread tends to add another layer to an already complicated picture rather than simplifying it. One more development worth including here. Trey Shepard, the friend who already came forward publicly to explain his role in the viral confrontation video, addressed this waiting period directly in his own words. He said everybody needs to let the investigation continue and let the facts actually be shown. He said if those facts show that somebody harmed Nolan, he hopes justice is brought. And if it turns out to have been a tragic accident, one where somebody simply failed to speak up afterward, he still hopes justice is brought in that case too. He said the facts are the only thing that's actually going to settle any of this, and that he's waiting patiently to see them before forming any further opinion. He closed by saying simply that he knows he's lost his best friend. That's a notably different posture than a lot of the speculation surrounding this case. Shepard isn't defending his friend group as a whole, and he isn't accusing anyone either. He's asking for the same thing Nolan's own parents have asked for from the very beginning, actual answers rather than more theories. It's a genuinely difficult position to hold publicly and worth appreciating for what it actually requires. Shepard has already put his own name and reputation on the line once, correcting the record about the viral video at real personal risk, given the death threats he and his friends have described receiving. He could have used this same platform to defend his broader friend group more forcefully, or to push back harder against the growing public suspicion surrounding them. Instead, he's explicitly leaving the door open to either outcome, that someone may have genuinely harmed Nolan, or that this may have been a tragic accident compounded by someone's failure to speak up honestly afterward. Refusing to pick a side before the facts are actually in isn't the same as having nothing to say. Christine has shared in recent interviews a small, quiet detail that's easy to lose amid everything else in this case, but worth including here. She said the last time she actually saw Nolan in person was July 3rd, the night before the trip. She'd made the family salmon for dinner. He was heading out to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday weekend. She recalled him saying simply, "Hey Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." A hug, a kiss, and he left. That's the kind of detail that doesn't fit into any theory or any timeline dispute. It's just a mother's memory of an entirely ordinary goodbye, the kind every parent has said and heard 1,000 times, that turned out, without anyone knowing it in the moment, to be the last one. It's worth sitting with that contrast for a second, between the granular, contested detail of the rest of this case, timestamps, boat routes, who said what to whom, and this one simple, unremarkable memory. Christine has spent the last several weeks in interviews dissecting Snapchat windows, phone location data, and the exact minute a Coast Guard call was placed. But the memory she keeps returning to isn't analytical at all. It's just her son in a doorway, saying he loved her before he left. That's often what grief actually looks like underneath a public case like this one. Not just the demand for facts and accountability, real and legitimate as that demand is, but also the quiet, private task of holding on to the last ordinary moments before everything else about that day became extraordinary in the worst possible way. So, pulling this together, the FBI is now in contact with local investigators, expanding this case beyond a single county sheriff's office. Formal witness interviews are underway. Katie, the young woman at the center of the original contradiction, has been publicly identified and accounted for, and her family's account, relayed secondhand, does not support the friend's version of what happened. Both autopsies remain pending, with no confirmed release date for either. And in the middle of it all, a close friend has publicly chosen to wait for the actual facts rather than add to the speculation, while a grieving mother holds on to the memory of an ordinary goodbye that never got a chance to be followed by another one.